The words still echo in my mind like a slap that never stops stinging. Honestly, Hazel, you smell like old people. It's embarrassing. Those weren't the words of a stranger or some cruel teenager. They came from my daughter-in-law, Madison, spoken with the casual cruelty of someone who thought she held all the power. She said it right there in my own kitchen, the kitchen where I had spent countless hours preparing meals for my family, where I had celebrated birthdays and holidays, where I had poured my heart into making everyone feel loved and welcome. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I never imagined that the woman my son brought home would become the architect of my greatest humiliation. But life has a way of surprising you, doesn't it? Sometimes the people you open your heart to are the very ones who will use that vulnerability to destroy you. And sometimes, just sometimes, that destruction becomes the catalyst for the most incredible transformation of your life. My name is Hazel Griffin, and if you had told me 3 years ago that I would be sitting in a penthouse apartment overlooking the Manhattan skyline, sipping champagne that costs more than most people's monthly rent, I would have laughed until I cried. 3 years ago, I was a 62-year-old widow living in a modest 2-bedroom house in Millbrook, Connecticut, spending my days tending to my garden and my evenings watching reruns of old television shows. I was invisible to most of the world, just another aging woman whose best years were supposedly behind her. But that was before Madison entered my life like a perfectly manicured tornado, and before I discovered just how much fire still burned inside this supposedly tired old soul. My husband Richard had passed away 5 years earlier, leaving me with a paid-off house, a small savings account, and our son Michael, who had always been the center of my universe. Richard and I had married young, and we had devoted our entire lives to building something stable and loving for our family. Richard worked as an accountant for a local firm, putting in long hours and steady work that never made us rich but kept us comfortable. I had worked part-time as a librarian when Michael was young, but mostly I focused on being the kind of mother and wife that my own mother had taught me to be. Selfless, devoted, always putting family first. When Richard died suddenly of a heart attack, I felt like half of myself had been ripped away, but Michael stepped up in ways that made my heart swell with pride. He called every day, visited twice a week, and made sure I never felt alone. He had grown into such a wonderful man, successful in his career as a software engineer, kind-hearted and thoughtful. When he told me he had met someone special, I was thrilled for him. After years of casual dating, he seemed genuinely excited about this woman, and I couldn't wait to meet her. Madison Walsh was everything I wasn't. 28 years old, blonde, stunning in that effortless way that comes with youth and good genetics. She worked in marketing for a high-end cosmetics company in New York City, lived in a trendy apartment in Brooklyn, and had the kind of confidence that came from never having been told no. When Michael first brought her home for dinner, I pulled out all the stops. I spent days planning the menu, cleaning the house until it sparkled, and buying fresh flowers for every room. I wanted her to love our home the way I did, to see the warmth and care that had gone into every corner. That first dinner seemed to go well. Madison was polite, even charming, asking about my garden and commenting on the family photos that lined the mantel. She laughed at my stories about Michael's childhood and seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me. Michael was practically glowing, holding her hand across the table and looking at me with such gratitude that I felt my heart might burst. This was what I had always wanted for him. Someone who would love him the way Richard had loved me, someone who would build a life with him, filled with joy and partnership. Over the following months, Madison became a regular presence in our lives. She would come for Sunday dinners, holiday celebrations, and casual weekend visits. I threw myself into the role of welcoming future mother-in-law with the same dedication I had brought to everything else in my life. I learned her favorite foods and always made sure to have them ready when she visited. I asked about her work, her friends, her family. I even started learning about skincare and makeup, topics that had never interested me much, because they were important to her. When Michael proposed, I cried tears of joy. The wedding planning became an all-consuming project for all of us, and I was grateful to be included. Madison's own mother lived in California and was dealing with health issues, so I stepped in to help with everything from venue visits to dress shopping. I offered to pay for the flowers, a gesture that I thought showed how much I cared about making their day perfect. Madison accepted graciously, even giving me a hug and calling me the best future mother-in-law ever. The wedding was beautiful, held at a historic mansion in the Hudson Valley with 200 guests. I had never seen Michael so happy, and watching him dance with Madison during their first dance as a married couple, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This was what all those years of sacrifice had been for. This was the moment when all the difficult times, all the loneliness after Richard's death, all the worry about Michael's future, paid off. He had found his person, and I had gained a daughter. But weddings, I learned, are just one day. Marriage is what comes after, and that's when the real dynamics reveal themselves. The changes started small, so subtle that I almost convinced myself I was imagining them. Madison began declining my invitations to Sunday dinner, claiming she was too tired from work or had other plans. When she did come, she seemed distracted, checking her phone constantly and contributing less to the conversation. Michael started visiting less frequently too, and when I asked about it, he explained that married life was busy, that they were trying to establish their own traditions as a couple. I understood, or at least I tried to. Every parent has to learn to step back and let their children build their own lives. But then came the comments. Small things at first, delivered with a laugh as if they were jokes. Madison would mention how quaint my house was, how vintage my furniture looked, how sweet it was that I still used the same recipes my mother had taught me. There was always a tone underneath these observations, a subtle condescension that made me feel smaller each time. When I redecorated the guest room, thinking fresh paint and new curtains might make the space more appealing for their visits, Madison commented that it looked very retirement home chic. Michael laughed along with her, not seeming to notice how the words stung. The worst part was how invisible I began to feel in my own home. When they came for visits, Madison would suggest restaurants instead of eating my cooking, claiming she was watching her figure or trying to be healthier. She would rearrange the living room furniture to be more conversation-friendly, which somehow always meant pushing my favorite chair into a corner where I couldn't participate in discussions as easily. She started bringing her own coffee, saying mine was too strong or not the right brand. I tried to adapt. I bought new furniture, softer and more modern than the pieces Richard and I had collected over the years. I learned to make quinoa salads and kale smoothies, even though I secretly missed my pot roasts and apple pies. I updated my wardrobe, trading my comfortable cardigans for more contemporary pieces that Madison assured me were more flattering. I even got highlights in my hair, something I had never done in my entire life, because Madison said it would brighten my complexion. But nothing I did seemed to be enough. Every effort to
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
modernize or improve myself was met with new criticisms, new suggestions for how I could be better, more acceptable. I started to feel like a project that Madison had taken on, something she was trying to fix but that was fundamentally flawed beyond repair. The breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon in October. I had been battling a cold for several days but was finally feeling better, so I decided to surprise Michael and Madison with a homemade apple pie. I knew it was Michael's favorite, and I thought bringing it to their apartment might be a nice gesture. I had gotten their spare key months earlier, back when Madison had insisted I should have one for emergencies, and I figured dropping off a pie hardly required calling ahead. I drove the hour into Brooklyn, navigating the confusing streets with the help of my GPS, carrying the still warm pie in my best ceramic dish. Their apartment building was one of those converted warehouses that seemed to be everywhere in that part of the city, all exposed brick and industrial fixtures. I took the elevator to the 4th floor and used my key to let myself in, calling out a cheerful "hello" as I opened the door. Madison was on the phone, pacing in front of the large windows that overlooked the street. She was wearing yoga pants and an oversized sweater, her hair in a messy bun, looking effortlessly beautiful even in casual clothes. When she saw me, her expression shifted to something I couldn't quite read. She held up a finger, indicating I should wait while she finished her call. "I know, right? It's like living with a ghost from another era," she was saying, not seeming to realize that I could hear every word. She just doesn't get it. Everything about her is so dated. The way she dresses, the way she talks, even the way she smells. It's like old people smell, you know? That combination of mothballs and expired perfume and just age. It's honestly embarrassing when she comes around, my friends. My hand tightened around the pie dish. The kitchen suddenly felt too warm, too small. I stood there frozen, listening to my daughter-in-law describe me to her friend like I was some kind of unfortunate burden she had to tolerate. Michael doesn't see it because she's his mom, but God, it's painful sometimes. Like, I'm trying to build a sophisticated life here, and then she shows up with her little homemade crafts and her stories about the old days. It's suffocating. She laughed then, a sound that felt like broken glass in my chest. I've been trying to hint that maybe she should consider one of those senior communities. You know, somewhere she could be around people, more her own speed. But Michael gets all sensitive about it. Honestly, sometimes I wonder if marrying into this family was worth it. I don't remember setting the pie down on the counter. I don't remember walking back to the door or getting into my car. The next thing I knew, I was sitting in the parking lot of a coffee shop halfway home, crying so hard I couldn't catch my breath. The cruelest part wasn't even the words themselves, though they cut deep enough. It was the casual nature of it, the way she talked about me like I was a piece of furniture that didn't quite fit the decor. I wasn't a person to her. I was an inconvenience, an embarrassment, something to be managed or removed. I drove home in a daze, my mind replaying the conversation over and over. Had I really become so pathetic? Was I truly embarrassing? I went straight to my bedroom and looked at myself in the full-length mirror, really looked for the first time in months. What I saw was a woman who had been trying so hard to please someone who would never be pleased, who had abandoned pieces of herself in a desperate attempt to be acceptable to someone who had already decided she wasn't worth accepting. That night, Michael called. "Mom, Madison said you stopped by and left a pie. That was so sweet of you. She said you seemed upset about something, though. Is everything okay?" I wanted to tell him everything. I wanted to scream about what I had heard, about how his wife talked about me when she thought I couldn't hear. But what good would it do? He would either not believe me or he would believe me, and it would cause problems in his marriage. Either way, I would be the problem. I would be the difficult mother-in-law who caused drama and made trouble. "I'm fine, sweetheart," I lied. "Just tired. I think I might be coming down with something again." "Well, take care of yourself. Madison and I were thinking of coming for dinner this weekend if you're feeling up to it." I almost laughed at the irony. After everything I had heard, they still expected me to cook for them, to play the role of the loving mother-in-law who was grateful for their presence in my life. "Actually, Michael, I think I might be busy this weekend. Maybe another time." There was a pause. "Oh, okay. Are you sure you're feeling all right? You sound different." "I'm fine. Just have some things to take care of. I'll call you next week." I hung up before he could ask any more questions. For the first time in months, maybe years, I didn't care if Madison approved of my plans. I didn't care if my house met her standards, or if my cooking was sophisticated enough for her palate. I was done trying to shrink myself to fit into the narrow space she had allotted for me in their lives. But I wasn't done with Madison. Not by a long shot. Over the following weeks, I began to notice things I had been too eager to please to see before. The way Madison's eyes would glaze over when I spoke about anything that mattered to me. How she would steer conversations away from topics I was passionate about, dismissing my interests as cute or nostalgic. The way she would exchange glances with Michael when she thought I wasn't looking. Little eye rolls and smirks that made me feel like I was performing in some kind of sad comedy show. I started paying attention to the financial dynamics too. Madison had expensive tastes, always carrying designer handbags and wearing clothes that I knew cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. Their apartment, which I had initially admired for its style, was clearly stretching their budget. I knew what Michael made, and even with Madison's marketing salary, the math didn't quite add up for the lifestyle they were maintaining. And then there were the hints. Madison had started making casual comments about how nice it must be to have a paid-off house, how lucky I was to have built equity over the years. She would mention how difficult it was for young couples to get ahead in this economy, how unfair it was that older generations had been able to buy property when it was actually affordable. The comments always came with a sweet smile, but the message underneath was clear. I had something she wanted, and she was starting to think she deserved it more than I did. The final straw came during Thanksgiving. I had volunteered to host despite everything that had happened, because I couldn't bear the thought of Michael spending the holiday anywhere else. I spent 3 days preparing, making all of his favorite dishes, and setting the table with my grandmother's china. Madison arrived 2 hours late, claiming traffic, wearing a white cashmere dress that probably cost more than my car payment. She spent the entire meal criticizing everything from the seasoning on the turkey to the choice of wine, all delivered with that same sweet smile that had initially charmed me. When I brought out the pumpkin pie I had made from scratch, she actually wrinkled her nose and said, "Oh, Hazel, you know I don't eat refined sugar. Didn't I mention that last time?" But the moment that changed everything came when we were cleaning up. Madison was loading the dishwasher, making a great show of being helpful, when she picked up one of my grandmother's teacups and examined it with the kind of expression you might use when handling something distasteful. "These are really old, aren't they?" she said, holding the delicate porcelain up to the light. "I mean, they're probably worth something to the right collector, but they're not really practical for everyday use. When Michael and I have our own place, a real place, I mean, we'll want something more modern, more hygienic." She set the cup down with just a little too much force, not quite breaking it but making it clear that she wouldn't care if she had. "Honestly, Hazel, you could probably make some decent money selling all this vintage stuff. There are people who collect this kind of thing, people who are into the whole shabby chic aesthetic. It might be time to think about downsizing anyway. This house is really too big for one person, don't you think?" I looked around the kitchen where I had raised my son, where I had shared 35 years of marriage with my husband, where every corner held memories that had shaped who I was. Madison saw square footage and resale value. She saw an inconvenient obstacle to her own ambitions. That night, after they left, I sat in my living room, surrounded by the things Madison had deemed outdated and impractical. My grandmother's china, my mother's quilts, the books I had collected over a lifetime of reading, the photographs that chronicled decades of love and loss and ordinary happiness. She was right about one thing. It was worth something. She just had no idea how much, and she had no idea that I was about to make sure she never got her perfectly manicured hands on any of it. The seeds of my plan began to form that very night, though I didn't recognize them as such at the time. It started with a simple Google search: how to protect assets from family members. I told myself I was just being practical, just making sure that when my time came, my belongings would go where I wanted them to go. But as I read article after article about estate planning and asset protection, a different kind of idea began to take shape. Madison wanted my house, my money, my life to make room for her own ambitions. She saw me as an impediment to be removed, a problem to be solved. But what she didn't understand was that she had just declared war on someone who had absolutely nothing left to lose. And I had just realized that I had more weapons than she could possibly imagine. The first thing I did was change my will, not dramatically, not in any way that would raise immediate suspicions, but enough to ensure that Madison would never get her hands on what she so clearly coveted. I made an appointment with Harold Pemberton, the estate attorney who had handled Richard's affairs, and spent a morning going through my assets with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. Harold was a man in his 70s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and the patient demeanor of someone who had spent decades helping people navigate their most vulnerable moments. He had guided me through the labyrinth of paperwork after Richard's death, and I trusted him completely. "I want to make some changes," I told him, settling into the leather chair across from his mahogany desk. "I want to establish a trust, something that will protect my assets and ensure they go where I intend them to go." Harold nodded, pulling out a yellow legal pad. "Of course, Hazel. What kind of changes are you thinking about?" I had spent weeks researching this, reading everything I could find about trusts and estate planning. "I want to create an irrevocable trust. I want to transfer ownership of my house and the majority of my savings into it, with specific instructions about how and when the assets can be distributed. And who would you like to name as beneficiaries? I smiled, thinking of the conversation I had overheard in Madison's kitchen. I want to establish scholarships, full scholarships for underprivileged students who want to study library science or education, students who understand the value of knowledge and service, who want to make a difference in their communities. Harold's eyebrows rose slightly. That's very generous, Hazel. And your son Michael? Michael will receive a modest inheritance, enough to be comfortable but not enough to fund the kind of lifestyle Madison has in mind. I want him to understand that money should be earned, not expected. The lawyer was quiet for a moment, his pen hovering over the legal pad. Hazel, I have to ask. Is everything all right at home? These changes seem quite significant, and I want to make sure you're making these decisions for the right reasons. I appreciated his concern, but I had never been more certain of anything in my life. Everything is perfectly fine, Harold. In fact, everything is clearer than it's been in years. I've spent my entire life putting other people's needs ahead of my own, and I'm finally ready to do something that matters to me. The process took several weeks to complete, involving appraisals, paperwork, and legal filings that made my head spin. But with each document I signed, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders. Madison could scheme and hint and manipulate all she wanted. She could roll her eyes at my vintage belongings and make her snide comments about downsizing. None of it mattered anymore because she would never, ever benefit from my death. But protecting my assets was only the first step. The real awakening came when I realized that I didn't have to wait until I died to start living for myself. I began with small changes, things that Madison and Michael might not even notice. I stopped making my Sunday dinners elaborate productions designed to impress. Instead, I cooked what I wanted to eat, simple comfort foods that reminded me of my childhood. When Madison complained about the lack of gluten-free options, I shrugged and suggested she bring her own food if mine didn't meet her dietary requirements. I also stopped seeking their approval for every decision I made. When I decided to repaint the living room a warm sage green instead of the neutral beige Madison had suggested, I didn't ask for their input. When I bought a new car, a cheerful red Honda Civic that made me smile every time I saw it in the driveway, I didn't concern myself with whether it met Madison's standards for sophistication. The most liberating change was how I dressed. For months, I had been trying to recreate myself in Madison's image, buying clothes that felt foreign and uncomfortable because she had convinced me they were more age-appropriate or flattering. I cleaned out my closet and donated every single item that I had purchased to please her. Then I went shopping for myself, buying clothes that reflected who I actually was, comfortable, practical pieces in colors that made me happy, vintage-inspired dresses that reminded me of my younger self, cardigans that were soft and cozy regardless of whether they were on trend. The transformation was gradual but undeniable. I started sleeping better, eating better, finding joy in small pleasures that I had forgotten existed. I rejoined the local garden club, something I had abandoned because Madison had made disparaging comments about ladies who lunch. I signed up for a pottery class at the community center, discovering a talent I never knew I had. I even adopted a cat from the local shelter, a beautiful orange tabby named Fitzgerald, who seemed to understand that we were both starting fresh. Michael noticed the changes, of course. During one of our increasingly infrequent phone calls, he commented that I seemed different lately. Different how? I asked, scratching Fitzgerald behind the ears as he purred on my lap. I don't know. More independent, I guess. Madison said you've been less interested in spending time with us lately. I wondered what else Madison had said, but I kept my voice neutral. I've been busy with my own activities. I've realized that I have interests and hobbies that I had been neglecting. That's great, Mom. I'm glad you're getting out more. Madison was worried that you might be lonely. The irony wasn't lost on me. Madison had spent months making me feel unwelcome in their lives, and now she was concerned about my loneliness. But I had learned to see through her performative caring. Tell Madison I appreciate her concern, but I'm doing very well. Better than I have in years, actually. And it was true. For the first time since Richard's death, I felt like myself again. Not the version of myself that I thought other people wanted me to be, but the real Hazel Griffin, the woman who had raised a son and buried a husband and survived more challenges than most people faced in a lifetime. I was rediscovering my own strength, my own worth, my own voice. But Madison wasn't done trying to manipulate the situation to her advantage. The next phase of her campaign began subtly, as her attacks always did. She started expressing concern about my mental state to Michael, suggesting that my new independence might be a sign of something more troubling. When I mentioned in passing that I had been taking pottery classes, she wondered aloud if I was having some kind of delayed grief reaction that was causing me to make impulsive decisions. Maybe she should talk to someone, I overheard her telling Michael during one of their visits. A therapist or a counselor. It's not normal for someone her age to suddenly change everything about their life. I'm worried she might be having some kind of breakdown. The gaslighting was masterful, I had to admit. By framing my newfound happiness and independence as signs of mental instability, she was positioning herself as the concerned daughter-in-law who was looking out for my best interests. And because Michael wanted to believe the best of his wife, he was starting to buy into her narrative. "Mom, Madison thinks maybe you should consider talking to someone," he said during our next phone call. "She's noticed that you've been making a lot of changes lately, and she's worried that maybe you're not processing Dad's death in a healthy way." I nearly laughed at the absurdity of it. Richard had been gone for 5 years. I had grieved him thoroughly, honestly, and completely. My recent changes had nothing to do with unresolved grief, and everything to do with finally breaking free from Madison's psychological manipulation. "Michael, I appreciate Madison's concern, but I'm fine. In fact, I'm better than fine. I'm happy. When was the last time you could say that about me?" He was quiet for a moment. I guess it has been a while. But don't you think it's worth talking to someone? Just to make sure? The only thing I need to talk about is how your wife has been trying to control every aspect of my life for the past 2 years. But since you don't seem interested in hearing about that, I think we should probably end this conversation. I hung up before he could respond, my hands shaking with anger. How dare they pathologize my happiness? How dare they try to turn my independence into evidence of mental illness? But their concern wasn't really about my well-being. It was about control. As long as I had been the lonely dependent widow who lived for their occasional visits and approval, I had been manageable. But a Hazel who had her own life, her own interests, her own sense of worth? That was dangerous to their plans. Madison's next move was more direct. She started suggesting that I might be more comfortable in a senior living community, somewhere I could have more social interaction and professional support. She brought me brochures for upscale retirement communities, glossy pamphlets full of smiling elderly people engaged in supervised activities. "Look at this place, Hazel," she said during one of their visits, spreading the brochures across my kitchen table. "They have art classes, book clubs, even a pottery studio. You'd love it there. And think about how much easier your life would be without having to worry about maintaining this big house." I looked at the brochures, at the carefully staged photographs of institutional cheerfulness, and felt a chill run down my spine. This was her endgame. Get me declared mentally incompetent, move me into managed care, and free up my house and assets for her own use. "I'm not interested," I said, sweeping the brochures into a neat pile and handing them back to her. "I love my home, and I'm perfectly capable of maintaining it." Madison's smile never wavered, but I caught a flash of something cold in her eyes. "Of course you are, Hazel. I just thought you might enjoy the company. But if you're happy here..." She left the sentence hanging, but the implication was clear. If I insisted on staying in my own home, I would be choosing isolation and loneliness. I would be making the wrong choice, the selfish choice, the choice that proved I wasn't thinking clearly. That night, after they left, I called Harold Pemberton. "Harold, I need to add something to my trust documents. I want to include specific language about my mental competency, something that makes it clear that I am of sound mind, and that any future claims to the contrary should be viewed with suspicion. Harold was quiet for a moment. Hazel, is someone challenging your mental competency? Not yet, but I have reason to believe they might try. I want to make sure my wishes are protected, regardless of what anyone might claim about my state of mind. I can certainly add that language to your documents. But Hazel, if you're feeling pressured or threatened by family members, there are other protections we can put in place. Elder abuse laws are quite comprehensive these days. Elder abuse. The term hit me like a physical blow. Was that what this was? All those months of criticism and manipulation, the gradual erosion of my confidence and autonomy, the attempts to isolate me from my own interests and relationships, I had been thinking of it as family drama, unpleasant but manageable. But Harold was right. What Madison had been doing to me was abuse, pure and simple. What kind of protections? I asked. We can establish a protective order if necessary. We can also set up your trust in such a way that it would be nearly impossible for anyone to challenge your competency or influence your decisions. Think of it as a legal firewall around your autonomy. I felt a surge of gratitude for this kind man who understood what I was facing without me having to spell it out for him. Let's do all of it, Harold. Every protection you can think of. There's one more thing we should consider, Hazel. Have you thought about what you want to do with your life now? You're 62 years old, you're in good health, and if you liquidate some of your assets, you could have enough money to do almost anything you want. Travel, relocate, start a new career, go back to school. You don't have to spend the rest of your life defending yourself against people who don't have your best interests at heart. His words opened up possibilities I hadn't even considered. For so long, I had been focused on protecting what I had, on defending my territory against Madison's encroachment. But what if I didn't have to stay and fight? What if I could simply leave? Start over somewhere else? Build a life that had nothing to do with their expectations or manipulations. What would that look like, practically speaking? I asked. Well, if you sold your house, you could probably net around $400,000, maybe more in this market. Combined with your savings and investments, you could afford to live quite comfortably anywhere in the country. Or even abroad, if that interests you. $400,000. I had known my house had appreciated over the years, but I hadn't realized how much. That was enough to buy a smaller place outright and still have money left over for travel, for education, for whatever adventures I wanted to pursue. And the trust fund for the scholarships? That would remain intact. In fact, if you're serious about making a significant charitable impact, liquidating your assets and setting up a larger trust fund would probably be more effective than leaving everything in your will. You could see the scholarships in action, meet the students you're helping, be involved in their success. The idea was intoxicating. Instead of spending my remaining years playing defense against Madison's schemes, I could go on offense. I could build something meaningful, something that would outlast all of us and make a real difference in the world. And in the process, I could make it clear to Madison that her manipulation had accomplished exactly the opposite of what she intended. How long would it take to arrange something like this? I asked. If you're serious about it, we could have everything in place within a few months. Selling the house might take a bit longer, depending on the market, but the legal structures could be established fairly quickly. I thought about Madison's face when she realized that not only would she never inherit my house, but that I had sold it and used the proceeds for charity. I thought about her reaction when she discovered that all her months of psychological warfare had resulted in her losing everything she had hoped to gain. Let's do it, Harold. All of it. I want to set up the scholarship trust, and I want to put my house on the market. It's time for me to start a new chapter. The decision felt like stepping off a cliff, terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. For weeks, I had been focused on small acts of rebellion, tiny assertions of independence that helped me reclaim pieces of myself. But this was bigger than that. This was a complete transformation, a wholesale rejection of the life that others had planned for me in favor of one I would design myself. The house hunting process began immediately. Harold referred me to a real estate agent named Patricia Wells, a woman about my age who specialized in helping people downsize and relocate. Patricia understood what I was looking for before I even finished explaining it. Something smaller but charming. Somewhere I could start fresh without the weight of decades of memories and expectations. We looked at condominiums in Boston, cottages in Vermont, even a small house in Savannah that made my heart race with its wraparound porch and mature garden. Each property represented a different version of my future self, a different way of being in the world. For the first time in years, I felt like I had choices, real choices that belonged to me alone. I settled on a beautiful 2-bedroom townhouse in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, just a few blocks from the historic downtown and walking distance to the harbor. It was charming without being precious, large enough for entertaining but small enough to manage easily, and it came with a small garden space where I could grow herbs and flowers. The mortgage would be minimal, and the location would give me access to cultural activities, good restaurants, and a community of people who were interested in more than just accumulating possessions. The paperwork for the trust fund was equally satisfying. Harold and I worked with the local community college to establish the Hazel and Richard Griffin Scholarship Fund, which would provide full tuition and book allowances for students pursuing degrees in education or library science. The fund would be administered by the college's financial aid office, ensuring that the money would go to students who truly needed it and who shared my values about the importance of education and service. When everything was in place, I called Michael to let him know about my plans. I chose a Saturday morning, when I knew he and Madison would be together, because I wanted them both to hear the news at the same time. "Mom, what do you mean you're selling the house?" Michael's voice was tight with confusion, and something that might have been panic. "I mean exactly what I said, sweetheart. I've put the house on the market, and I'm moving to New Hampshire. I've already found a lovely place, and I think I'm going to be very happy there." But why?" "I don't understand. This is our family home. This is where I grew up." I could hear Madison in the background, asking questions that Michael was answering in whispers. I imagined her face as she realized that her carefully laid plans were crumbling. "Michael, I need you to understand something. This house has been wonderful for our family, but it's time for me to think about what I want for the rest of my life. I'm 62 years old, and I have a lot of living left to do. I don't want to spend it rattling around in a house that's too big for me, maintaining more space than I need. What about when you get older? What about when you need help? When and if that time comes, I'll deal with it. But right now, I'm healthy and independent, and I want to live somewhere that reflects that." Madison must have taken the phone from Michael, because suddenly her voice was on the line, sweet and concerned in that way that made my skin crawl. "Hazel, honey, this seems like such a big decision to make so quickly. Have you really thought this through? Maybe we should all sit down and talk about it together, as a family." I almost laughed at her use of the word family, given how she had spent the past 2 years making it clear that I was an unwelcome appendage to their real family unit. "I've thought about it very carefully, Madison. In fact, I've been working with an attorney for several weeks to make sure everything is handled properly." "An attorney? Hazel, that seems like overkill. We're family. We can work through this together." "Actually, Madison, I'm glad you brought up the topic of family. Because part of my planning has involved setting up a scholarship fund in Richards and my name. Most of the proceeds from the house sale will go toward that fund, which will help young people pursue careers in education. I think it's a wonderful way to honor Richard's memory and create a lasting legacy." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. I could practically hear the gears turning in Madison's head as she processed what I had just told her. The house that she had been counting on inheriting was being sold, and the money was going to charity. That's very generous of you, Hazel," she finally managed. "But don't you think you should keep some of that money for yourself? For your retirement, for emergencies?" "I'll be keeping enough for my needs, don't worry. But I've realized that I don't need as much as I thought I did. And there's something very satisfying about knowing that my money will help young people build better lives for themselves." Michael took the phone back, his voice strained. "Mom, I don't understand why you're doing this. Are you angry about something? Did we do something wrong?" For a moment, I almost weakened. Michael sounded genuinely confused and hurt, and my maternal instincts wanted to comfort him, to reassure him that everything was fine. But everything wasn't fine, and it was time for him to understand that actions had consequences. "Michael, I'm not angry. I'm just finally putting my own needs first for once in my life. I hope you can understand that and be happy for me. But what about us? What about family dinners and holidays and all the traditions we've built? We can still have family dinners and holidays, sweetheart. They'll just be in a different house. And maybe some new traditions would be good for all of us. We talked for a few more minutes, with Michael asking increasingly desperate questions about my timeline and my plans. I answered what I could, but I could tell that he was struggling to accept that his predictable, reliable mother had just upended everything he thought he knew about his future. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen, looking around at the familiar spaces that had defined my life for so many years. There was sadness in letting go, of course. This house had witnessed my marriage, my son's childhood, my husband's death, and my own slow awakening to the possibilities that still existed in my life. But there was also excitement, a sense of anticipation that I hadn't felt in decades. Madison thought she had been playing a long game, gradually wearing down my resistance until I would gratefully accept whatever scraps of attention and respect she was willing to throw my way. She thought she was dealing with a lonely old woman who could be manipulated through guilt and false concern. But she had miscalculated badly. Instead of breaking me down, her cruelty had awakened something fierce and determined. Instead of making me smaller, she had forced me to realize how much bigger my life could be. The scholarship fund was just the beginning. In New Hampshire, I would have the freedom to explore interests I had abandoned, to meet new people who knew nothing about my history as the disappointed mother-in-law. I could volunteer for causes I cared about, travel to places I had always wanted to see, maybe even pursue the graduate degree in library science that I had put aside when I got married. Most importantly, I would be living a life that belonged entirely to me, free from the expectations and manipulations of people who had never truly seen me as anything more than a resource to be exploited. Madison wanted to make me smell like bankruptcy? She had no idea that I was about to make her face the poverty of her own character, the emptiness of a life built on using and discarding other people. And I was going to enjoy every minute of it. The first sign that Madison wasn't taking my independence quietly came 3 days after our phone conversation. I was in my garden, enjoying the late afternoon sun while transplanting some of my mother's heirloom roses to smaller pots that could make the move to New Hampshire with me, when I heard a car pulling into my driveway. Through the hedge, I could see Madison's silver BMW, and my stomach immediately tightened. She got out of the car alone, which surprised me. Madison rarely went anywhere without Michael as her buffer, especially when she was planning something unpleasant. She was dressed in what I had come to recognize as her serious business outfit, a tailored black suit with a crisp white blouse, her hair pulled back in a sleek ponytail, her makeup flawless despite the hour-long drive from Brooklyn. She looked like she was heading to a board meeting, not visiting her mother-in-law's garden. "Hazel," she called out, her voice carrying that artificially warm tone that made my skin crawl. "I hope you don't mind me stopping by. I was in the neighborhood and thought we should talk." I set down my gardening spade and brushed the soil from my hands, taking my time to compose myself. Madison was never in the neighborhood of my Connecticut town unless she had a specific agenda, and her sudden appearance so soon after our conversation about the house sale was no coincidence. "Of course, dear. Would you like some iced tea? I just made a fresh pitcher." "That would be lovely." I led her through the back door into the kitchen, noting how her eyes swept the room with the calculating gaze of an appraiser. She was probably already mentally rearranging the furniture, planning how she would redecorate once she got her hands on the place. The thought made me smile, though I kept my expression neutral. As I poured the tea, Madison settled herself at the kitchen table, smoothing her skirt and folding her hands in her lap like a schoolgirl preparing for a difficult conversation with the principal. "Hazel, I've been thinking about our conversation the other day, and I have to say I'm concerned. This decision to sell the house and move to New Hampshire seems so sudden, so unlike you. Are you sure you've thought it through completely?" I handed her a glass of tea and sat down across from her, studying her face. She was good at this, I had to admit. Her expression was perfectly calibrated to convey caring concern, with just a hint of gentle reproach. If I hadn't spent the past few months learning to see through her manipulations, I might have been fooled. I've thought about it very carefully, Madison. In fact, I've been considering a change like this for quite some time. Richard's death made me realize how short life can be, and I don't want to waste whatever time I have left maintaining a house that's too big for my needs. But this house is Michael's inheritance, she said, leaning forward slightly. It's been in your family for decades. Don't you think he should have a say in whether it gets sold? There it was, the entitlement laid bare. In Madison's mind, my house already belonged to her and Michael, and I was just the inconvenient current occupant who needed to be managed until they could take possession. Madison, this house belongs to me. Michael will inherit what I choose to leave him, but that doesn't give him any authority over my decisions while I'm alive. Her carefully composed expression flickered for just a moment, revealing a flash of something cold and calculating before she recovered her mask of concern. Of course, you're absolutely right. I didn't mean to suggest otherwise. It's just that Michael is so attached to this place, and I hate to see him hurt unnecessarily. I think Michael will be fine. He's a grown man with his own life and his own home. He doesn't need his childhood bedroom preserved like a museum. Madison sipped her tea, buying herself time to regroup. When she looked up again, her strategy had shifted. Hazel, I hope you won't take this the wrong way, but I have to ask. Have you talked to anyone about this decision? A counselor? Maybe? Or your doctor? Sometimes when people are dealing with grief or loneliness, they can make impulsive choices that they later regret. The gaslighting was so smooth, so practiced, that I almost admired her skill. She was suggesting that I was mentally unstable without actually saying the words, planting seeds of doubt that she could later cultivate if she needed to challenge my competency. My mental health is excellent, thank you for asking. I've actually never felt clearer about what I want for my life. I'm sure that's true, but sometimes we can't see our own blind spots. Maybe it would be worth talking to a professional, just to make sure you're considering all the angles. I set down my tea glass and looked directly into her eyes. Madison, let me be very clear about something. I am not confused, depressed, or mentally incompetent. I am making informed decisions about my own life, decisions that I have every legal right to make. If you or Michael have concerns about my mental state, you're welcome to express them, but they won't change anything. Her mask slipped again, and for a moment I saw the real Madison, calculating, frustrated, and more than a little angry. She recovered quickly, but not quickly enough. Of course, Hazel. I didn't mean to imply otherwise. I'm just worried about you, that's all. This is such a big change, and you'll be all alone in a new place where you don't know anyone. I'm looking forward to meeting new people and exploring new opportunities. I think it will be an adventure. Madison tried a different approach. What about the financial aspect? Real estate transactions can be so complicated, and there are so many ways to get taken advantage of. Are you working with someone you trust? I have an excellent attorney and a very reputable real estate agent. Everything is being handled properly. An attorney? That seems like overkill for a simple house sale. Are you sure they're not charging you unnecessary fees? I almost laughed at her transparent attempt to find holes in my planning. Harold Pemberton has been our family attorney for 20 years. He handled Richard's estate, and I trust him completely. At the mention of Harold's name, something changed in Madison's expression. It was subtle, just a slight tightening around her eyes, but I caught it. Harold Pemberton, she repeated slowly. I think Michael mentioned him before. Didn't he handle some kind of trust or something for Richard? He handled all of Richard's legal affairs, yes. And now he's helping me with mine. Madison nodded, but I could see the wheels turning behind her eyes. She was filing away information, probably planning to pump Michael for more details about Harold and what kind of legal work he had done for our family. Well, I'm sure he knows what he's doing. It's just that sometimes older attorneys can be a bit set in their ways, you know? There might be newer, more creative approaches to estate planning that could save you money or give you more flexibility. I'm quite satisfied with Harold's work, thank you. Madison finished her tea and glanced at her watch, a subtle signal that she was preparing to leave. But I could tell she hadn't accomplished whatever she had come here to do. Hazel, I hope you know that Michael and I only want what's best for you. If you ever change your mind about any of this, or if you need help with anything, you just have to call. That's very kind of you, Madison. She stood up and smoothed her skirt again, then surprised me by reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. Her touch was cold despite the warm afternoon. "I hope you'll think about what I said. About talking to someone, I mean. Sometimes an objective perspective can be really helpful." After she left, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, thinking about the conversation and what it revealed about Madison's state of mind. She was clearly panicking about my decision to sell the house, but there was something else underneath her concern, something that felt more calculated and dangerous. The mention of Harold had triggered something in her, a recognition that made me wonder if she knew more about our family's legal affairs than she had let on. And her repeated suggestions that I seek counseling weren't just casual concerns about my mental health. She was laying groundwork for something, building a case that she could use later if she decided to challenge my decisions more directly. That night, I called Harold at home, something I had never done before but felt was necessary given the circumstances. "Harold, I'm sorry to bother you at home, but I need to ask you something confidential. Have you had any contact with my daughter-in-law, Madison Walsh? Any phone calls or inquiries about my legal affairs?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "No, Hazel, I haven't heard from her. Why do you ask?" I told him about Madison's visit and her reaction when I mentioned his name. "I have a feeling she's going to try to find out more about what we've been working on. I want to make sure she can't access any information about my affairs. She has no legal standing to request information about your estate or your trust, and I would never discuss your private matters with anyone without your explicit consent. But Hazel, I'm concerned about this pattern of behavior. Have you considered documenting these interactions?" "Documenting them how?" "Keep a journal of every conversation, every visit, every attempt to pressure or manipulate you. Include dates, times, and as much detail as you can remember. If this escalates to the point where you need legal protection, having a detailed record will be invaluable." I started the journal that very night, writing down everything I could remember about my interactions with Madison over the past few months. The pattern that emerged was even more disturbing than I had realized. Every conversation, every seemingly innocent comment, every suggestion had been part of a carefully orchestrated campaign to undermine my confidence and independence. The next few weeks passed quietly, and I began to hope that Madison had accepted my decisions and moved on. The house was showing well, with several interested buyers scheduling second viewings. My real estate agent, Patricia, was optimistic that we would have an offer soon, possibly even multiple offers that could drive up the final sale price. I was packing books in my study when the phone rang. It was Michael, and his voice sounded strained. "Mom, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me. Are you having any memory problems? Any confusion or difficulty keeping track of things?" My blood ran cold. "No, Michael, I'm not having any memory problems. Why would you ask such a thing? Madison mentioned that when she visited you last week, you seemed confused about some things. She said you couldn't remember conversations you'd had, and that you repeated yourself several times." The lie was so brazen, so completely fabricated, that for a moment I was speechless. Madison was escalating her campaign, moving from subtle gaslighting to outright character assassination. "Michael, that is absolutely not true. I remember our conversation perfectly, and I was completely coherent throughout her visit. If Madison told you otherwise, she's lying." "Mom, that's a pretty serious accusation. Why would Madison lie about something like that?" "Because she's trying to build a case that I'm mentally incompetent, so she can challenge my decision to sell the house. Think about it, Michael. Does it make sense that I would suddenly develop memory problems just when I'm making decisions she doesn't like?" Michael was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know what to think, Mom. Madison seemed really worried about you. She even suggested that maybe you should see a doctor, just to rule out any medical issues. I see my doctor regularly for checkups, and there's nothing wrong with my memory or my mental faculties. But I'm starting to understand what's happening here. Madison has been planting seeds of doubt about my competency, and now she's escalating to outright lies. I think you need to ask yourself why your wife is so invested in undermining your mother's autonomy. That's not fair, Mom. Madison loves you. She's just concerned. Madison loves the idea of inheriting my house and my money. She doesn't love me, Michael. If she did, she wouldn't be trying to have me declared mentally incompetent." The conversation ended badly, with Michael defending his wife and me feeling more isolated than ever. But I wasn't helpless. and I wasn't going to let Madison's lies go unchallenged. The next morning, I called my physician, Dr. Sarah Chen, and scheduled an appointment for a complete physical and cognitive assessment. I need comprehensive documentation of my mental and physical health, I told her. I'm concerned that someone may try to challenge my competency, and I want medical evidence that clearly establishes my cognitive function. Dr. Chen was puzzled but professional. Hazel, you seem perfectly healthy to me, both physically and mentally. Is someone suggesting otherwise? My daughter-in-law has been telling my son that I'm showing signs of memory loss and confusion. It's not true, but I want medical documentation to prove it. The examination was thorough, including blood work, cognitive tests, and a detailed review of my medical history. Dr. Chen also arranged for me to see a neurologist for additional cognitive testing, just to be absolutely certain that there were no underlying issues. The results, as I expected, were completely normal. In fact, Dr. Chen noted that my cognitive function was excellent for someone my age, and that I showed no signs of dementia, depression, or any other condition that might impair my judgment. I'm going to write a detailed letter documenting your examination and test results, she told me. I'll send copies to you and to Harold Pemberton, since you mentioned he's your attorney. This should provide clear evidence of your mental competency if anyone questions it. Armed with medical documentation of my sound mental health, I felt more confident about confronting Madison's lies directly. But before I could decide how to proceed, she made her next move. I was in my garden again, this time digging up perennials that I wanted to take with me to New Hampshire, when I noticed a car parked across the street from my house. It was a nondescript sedan with tinted windows, and it had been there for several hours. When I first noticed it, I assumed it belonged to someone visiting one of my neighbors. But as the afternoon wore on and the car remained in the same spot, I began to feel uneasy. I went inside and watched from my living room window. The car was still there, and I could see the silhouette of someone in the driver's seat. They appeared to be watching my house. That evening, the car was gone, but it was back the next morning. This time, I decided to be proactive. I walked across the street and approached the vehicle, my heart pounding but my resolve firm. The driver was a middle-aged man in a cheap suit, with the kind of face that you would forget 5 minutes after meeting him. When he saw me approaching, he started the engine, but I was close enough to tap on his window before he could drive away. He rolled the window down halfway, looking annoyed and slightly embarrassed. "Can I help you?" he asked. "I'm Hazel Griffin, and this is my house you've been watching. I'd like to know why you're surveilling my property." The man's expression shifted from annoyance to something like panic. "I'm not watching anything, lady. I'm just waiting for someone. You've been waiting in the same spot for 2 days. Either you're the most patient person in the world or you're lying. Who hired you to watch me?" He rolled up his window without answering and drove away quickly, but not before I managed to memorize his license plate number. I called Harold immediately and told him about the surveillance. "This is escalating beyond family drama, Hazel. Someone is investing serious money in monitoring your activities, which suggests they're planning something significant. I think it's time to consider involving law enforcement." What would I tell them? That my daughter-in-law doesn't like my decision to sell my house? You tell them that you're being stalked and harassed by someone who has hired a private investigator to monitor your daily activities. That's illegal in Connecticut without a court order or legitimate cause. Harold helped me file a report with the local police, providing them with the license plate number and a detailed account of the surveillance. The detective who took my statement was sympathetic but realistic about what they could do. "We'll look into the license plate and see if we can identify the vehicle and its owner," Detective Rodriguez told me. "But unless we can prove that the surveillance is connected to some kind of criminal activity, there's not much we can do to stop it." "What if it's connected to an attempt to have me declared mentally incompetent? Would that constitute criminal activity?" Detective Rodriguez raised an eyebrow. "Is someone trying to have you declared incompetent?" I told her about Madison's lies to Michael, her suggestions that I seek counseling, and her pattern of trying to undermine my credibility. The detective took notes and nodded thoughtfully. "What you're describing could potentially be considered elder abuse, especially if it's part of a larger scheme to gain control of your assets. We'll include that information in our investigation." 3 days later, Detective Rodriguez called me with an update. We traced the license plate to a private investigation firm in Hartford. The firm is legitimate, but they're not required to tell us who hired them unless we can show probable cause for a criminal investigation. What I can tell you is that the surveillance has stopped, probably because you confronted the investigator directly. So someone paid to have me watched, but we can't find out who, not without more evidence of criminal intent. But Mrs. Griffin, I want you to know that we're taking this seriously. If the surveillance resumes, or if you experience any other forms of harassment, call us immediately. That night, I sat in my living room with Fitzgerald purring on my lap, thinking about how dramatically my life had changed in just a few months. The quiet, predictable existence I had built after Richard's death was gone, replaced by something that felt like a thriller novel. Madison's escalating desperation was turning my simple desire for independence into a complex legal and psychological battle. But I wasn't afraid. If anything, the surveillance had clarified something important for me. Madison wasn't just disappointed about losing her inheritance. She was actively working to undermine my autonomy and possibly my legal rights. This wasn't family drama anymore. It was warfare. And I was done playing defense. The next morning, I called Patricia with instructions to accept the best offer we had received on the house, even though it was slightly below asking price. I wanted the sale finalized as quickly as possible, before Madison could find some way to interfere with the transaction. I also called Harold and asked him to accelerate the timeline for establishing the scholarship trust. Instead of waiting until after the house sale, I wanted to transfer a significant portion of my savings immediately, making it legally impossible for anyone to challenge the distribution later. "Are you sure about this, Hazel?" Harold asked. "Once you transfer the assets to the trust, you won't be able to change your mind. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. I want that money working for something meaningful right now, not sitting in my account, waiting for someone to figure out how to steal it." Within a week, I had signed a purchase and sale agreement for my house and transferred $200,000 to the Hazel and Richard Griffin Scholarship Trust. The fund was now large enough to provide full scholarships for at least 4 students per year, with the possibility of expanding as investment returns accumulated. I called the community college's financial aid office to let them know about the increased funding, and the director, a young woman named Amanda Torres, was nearly speechless with gratitude. "Mrs. Griffin, this is incredible. Do you realize how many lives you're going to change with this gift? We have students who work 2 jobs while going to school, students who are raising children on their own, students who have been dreaming of careers in education but never thought they could afford the training. You're making their dreams possible." Hearing Amanda's excitement about the scholarship fund reminded me why I was doing all of this. It wasn't just about denying Madison her anticipated inheritance or proving my independence. It was about creating something positive and lasting, something that would continue making a difference long after all the drama with Madison was forgotten. But Madison wasn't ready to give up. Her next move came through Michael, and it was more sophisticated than anything she had tried before. "Mom, I've been doing some research about the decisions you've been making, and I think we need to have a serious conversation." Michael's voice on the phone was different than usual, more formal and distant. It reminded me of the tone he used in business meetings, professional and slightly intimidating. "What kind of research, Michael?" "I've been talking to some financial advisors about estate planning and asset protection. They've told me some things that I think you need to hear." My stomach tightened. Madison had clearly coached him for this conversation, probably armed him with just enough financial jargon to sound authoritative. "I'm listening." "Mom, giving away large amounts of money the way you've been doing can have serious tax implications. You could end up owing gift taxes that might eat up a significant portion of your remaining assets. And if you ever need long-term care, the transfers you've made could affect your eligibility for Medicaid." The concerns sounded legitimate, which made them more dangerous than Madison's previous attempts at manipulation. But I had discussed all of these issues with Harold before making any transfers, and I knew exactly where I stood. "Michael, I appreciate your concern, but I've worked with Harold to structure everything properly. The Scholarship Trust is set up as a charitable organization, which means the transfers qualify for tax deductions rather than gift taxes. And I have enough assets remaining to cover any long-term care needs I might have." "Are you sure about that? Because the advisors I talked to said that people often don't realize how expensive long-term care can be. Nursing homes can cost $6,000 a month or more. I could hear Madison coaching him, could almost see her standing beside him with a script of talking points designed to scare me into reconsidering my decisions. Michael, who are these financial advisors you've been talking to? Are they people you found yourself, or did Madison recommend them? There was a pause. Madison knows some people in the financial services industry through her work. They were kind enough to give me some informal advice. Of course they were. Madison had probably found advisors who would tell Michael exactly what she wanted him to hear, regardless of whether it was accurate or applicable to my specific situation. Michael, I want you to understand something. I am not making these decisions impulsively or without professional guidance. Harold Pemberton has been practicing estate law for 40 years, and he has guided me through every aspect of this process. If Madison's friends in the financial services industry disagree with his advice, I'm confident that Harold knows what he's doing. But Mom, what if Harold is wrong? What if you're making a mistake that you can't undo? The desperation in his voice was heartbreaking, but I couldn't let sympathy cloud my judgment. This was exactly what Madison wanted, for me to doubt myself, to second-guess my decisions, to give her an opening to regain control of the situation. Michael, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Are these concerns really coming from you, or are they coming from Madison? What do you mean? I mean that 6 months ago, you had never expressed any interest in my estate planning or my financial decisions. Suddenly, you're an expert on gift taxes and Medicaid eligibility. It's hard to believe that this newfound concern is entirely your idea. Madison and I are a team, Mom. We talk about everything, including our concerns about your welfare. And what exactly has Madison told you about my welfare? Another pause. She's worried that you're not thinking clearly, that you're making decisions based on emotion rather than logic. She thinks you might be having some kind of delayed reaction to Dad's death. There it was again. The suggestion that my mental health was compromised. Madison was persistent. I had to give her that. Michael, your father died 5 years ago. I grieved him thoroughly and completely. My current decisions have nothing to do with delayed grief, and everything to do with finally putting my own needs first for once in my life. But don't you see how sudden this all seems? 6 months ago, you were content with your life the way it was. Now you're selling the house, giving away money, moving to a different state. It's like you've become a completely different person. Maybe I have become a different person. Maybe I've become the person I was always meant to be, before I spent 40 years defining myself entirely through my relationships with other people. The conversation went on for another 20 minutes, with Michael raising increasingly desperate objections to my plans and me calmly refuting each one. By the end, I could hear the frustration in his voice, the realization that his mother was not going to be talked out of her independence. After I hung up, I felt a mixture of sadness and relief. Sadness because I could see how Madison's manipulation was affecting my relationship with my son. And relief because I had successfully defended my decisions against their coordinated attack. But I knew this wasn't over. Madison was clearly escalating her efforts, and the surveillance, the lies about my mental health, and now the financial scare tactics were all building towards something bigger. She was preparing for a more direct challenge to my competency, and I needed to be ready. The final assault came on a Tuesday morning in late October, just 2 weeks before my scheduled closing on the house. I was in my kitchen, enjoying a cup of coffee and reading the newspaper, when I heard cars pulling into my driveway. Through the window, I could see not just Madison's BMW, but also Michael's pickup truck, and a third vehicle I didn't recognize. My first instinct was alarm, but as I watched them get out of their cars, I felt something else, a strange sense of calm. Whatever Madison had been building toward, whatever final gambit she had planned, it was happening now. The waiting was over. Madison emerged from her car, looking like she was dressed for battle, a severe black suit, her hair pulled back tightly, her expression set in lines of grim determination. Michael looked uncomfortable, his usual easy confidence replaced by nervous energy as he glanced between Madison and the house. But it was the third person who made my blood run cold. She was a woman in her 50s, carrying a leather briefcase and wearing the kind of neutral, professional clothing that screamed, quote, court-appointed official. She had the bearing of someone accustomed to delivering bad news, and when she looked at my house, her expression was already calculating and detached. They approached my front door in formation, with Madison leading the charge and the unknown woman bringing up the rear. When the doorbell rang, I took a deep breath, smoothed my sweater, and went to answer it. "Hello, Michael." "Madison." I nodded to each of them in turn, then looked at the third woman. "I don't believe we've met." Madison stepped forward, her voice crisp and businesslike. "Hazel, this is Dr. Patricia Kellerman. She's a geriatric psychiatrist who specializes in cognitive assessments for elderly individuals. We've asked her to come here today to evaluate your current mental state." The audacity of it took my breath away. Madison had brought a psychiatrist to my home, without my consent, to conduct an impromptu evaluation that she clearly hoped would support her claims about my mental incompetence. "I see. And what gives you the authority to arrange psychiatric evaluations for me?" Dr. Kellerman stepped forward, her voice professionally neutral but with an underlying tone that suggested she was used to dealing with difficult patients. "Mrs. Griffin, your family has expressed serious concerns about your recent behavior and decision-making. They've provided documentation of what appears to be erratic judgment and possible cognitive decline. I'm here to conduct a brief assessment to determine whether you might benefit from additional support or intervention." "What kind of documentation?" Madison reached into her purse and pulled out a manila folder. "I've been keeping track of our conversations over the past few months, Hazel. The confusion, the memory lapses, the sudden personality changes. Dr. Kellerman has reviewed everything, and she agrees that an evaluation is warranted." I looked at Michael, who was staring at his shoes like a guilty child. "And you agreed to this ambush, Michael?" He finally looked up, his eyes filled with what might have been genuine concern or carefully rehearsed guilt. "Mom, we're worried about you. You're not acting like yourself, and some of the decisions you've been making don't seem rational. We just want to make sure you're okay." "I am perfectly okay, and I did not consent to any psychiatric evaluation." "Dr. Kellerman, I'm going to have to ask you to leave my property." Dr. Kellerman's expression didn't change. "Mrs. Griffin, I understand this is uncomfortable, but your family has the legal right to request a competency evaluation if they have reasonable concerns about your welfare. Connecticut law allows for emergency psychiatric assessments when there's evidence of cognitive impairment that might put an individual at risk." "What evidence? What risk?" Madison opened her folder and pulled out several sheets of paper. "The sudden decision to sell your family home, the large financial transfers to questionable charities, the paranoid accusations against family members, the isolation from friends and relatives, the refusal to seek medical or psychological help despite obvious signs of distress." Each accusation was a twisted version of the truth, presented in a way that made my reasonable decisions sound like symptoms of mental illness. Selling my house became evidence of impaired judgment. Establishing a scholarship fund became suspicious financial behavior. Standing up to Madison's manipulation became paranoid accusations. "Dr. Kellerman, before you proceed with any evaluation, I think you should know that I recently underwent comprehensive medical and cognitive testing with my personal physician. The results showed no evidence of cognitive impairment or mental health issues." "That's interesting," Dr. Kellerman said, making a note in her file. "Who conducted these tests?" "Dr. Sarah Chen, my primary care physician, and Dr. Robert Huang, a neurologist at Yale New Haven Hospital." Madison's confident expression flickered for just a moment. She hadn't expected me to have medical documentation ready, but she recovered quickly. "Hazel, you never mentioned any medical testing to us. When did this supposedly happen?" 3 weeks ago. I can provide you with copies of the reports if necessary." Dr. Kellerman looked interested. "I'd like to see those reports. In the meantime, would you be willing to answer a few questions? Just a brief conversation to help me understand your current state of mind." I considered my options. I could refuse to cooperate and have them leave, but that might actually support their case that I was being uncooperative and defensive. Or I could demonstrate my complete competency, so thoroughly that even Dr. Kellerman would have to admit that Madison's concerns were unfounded. "I'll answer your questions, Dr. Kellerman, but I want to be clear that this is voluntary cooperation, not a court-ordered evaluation. And I want everything documented, including the circumstances that brought you here. Of course. We moved to the living room, where Dr. Kellerman pulled out a small recording device and a notepad. Madison and Michael sat on the couch like spectators at a trial, while I settled into my favorite armchair with Fitzgerald on my lap. Dr. Kellerman began with standard cognitive assessment questions: the date, the current president, simple arithmetic problems, memory recall exercises. I answered each one calmly and correctly, watching Madison's expression grow increasingly tense as it became clear that my cognitive function was perfectly normal. Mrs. Griffin, I'd like to talk about some of the recent changes in your life. Can you tell me why you decided to sell your house? Certainly. I'm 62 years old, and this house is larger than I need for my current lifestyle. The maintenance and upkeep require more time and energy than I want to spend at this stage of my life. I found a smaller property in New Hampshire that better suits my needs and will allow me to live more independently. And the financial transfers your family mentioned? I established a charitable scholarship fund in memory of my late husband. The fund will provide educational opportunities for students pursuing careers in teaching and library science, fields that have always been important to me. Your family seems to feel that these decisions were made impulsively, without adequate consideration of the consequences. I glanced at Madison, who was leaning forward intently, clearly hoping I would say something that could be used against me. Dr. Kellerman, I worked with my attorney Harold Pemberton for several weeks to structure both the house sale and the charitable trust properly. Every decision was made after careful consultation with professionals and thorough consideration of the legal and financial implications. I fail to see how that constitutes impulsive behavior. Dr. Kellerman made more notes. Your daughter-in-law has expressed concern that you've become increasingly isolated and defensive in recent months. How would you respond to that? This was dangerous territory. If I criticized Madison too directly, it could be seen as evidence of the paranoid accusations she had mentioned. But I couldn't let her characterization go unchallenged. Dr. Kellerman, I've become more selective about how I spend my time and with whom I spend it. I've joined new social groups, pursued new hobbies, and made new friends. If Madison perceives that as isolation, perhaps it's because I'm no longer available to accommodate her schedule and preferences in the way I used to be. Can you give me specific examples of these new activities? I'm a member of the Portsmouth Garden Club, where I volunteer every Thursday. I take pottery classes at the community center on Tuesdays. I've started volunteering at the local library's literacy program on weekends. I have dinner plans with my neighbor Eleanor tomorrow evening, and I'm attending a lecture at the Historical Society on Friday. Each activity I mentioned was true, and I could see Dr. Kellerman noting the specificity and coherence of my responses. This was not the profile of someone experiencing cognitive decline or social isolation. Madison interrupted, her voice sharp with frustration. But what about the way you've been treating your family, Hazel? The way you've shut us out and made these huge decisions without consulting us. I turned to look at her directly, my voice calm but firm. Madison, I'm an adult woman making decisions about my own life and property. I don't require family approval for my choices, and I certainly don't owe you consultation about my estate planning. But we're your family. Don't you care about how your decisions affect us? I care about Michael's happiness and well-being. But my responsibility is to live my own life according to my own values and priorities, not to ensure that my assets will be distributed according to your expectations. The mask finally slipped completely. Madison's face flushed with anger, and her voice rose to a near shout. This is exactly what I'm talking about. You're being selfish and cruel, and you're destroying your relationship with your son because you can't stand the fact that he has a wife who loves him. Dr. Kellerman held up a hand, her professional demeanor sharpening. Mrs. Walsh, please lower your voice. Mrs. Griffin, how do you respond to your daughter-in-law's characterization of your behavior? I stroked Fitzgerald's fur, using the calming motion to keep my own voice steady. Dr. Kellerman, I think Madison's response just now is quite revealing. She's angry because my decisions don't align with her financial interests, and she's trying to frame my independence as mental illness or family betrayal. This is precisely the kind of manipulation I've been dealing with for months. Michael finally spoke up, his voice strained. Mom? That's not fair. Madison does love you, and she's just worried about you. Michael, if Madison loves me, why has she hired private investigators to surveil my home? Why has she been spreading false stories about my mental health? Why has she brought a psychiatrist to my house to try to have me declared incompetent? Dr. Kellerman's head snapped up. Mrs. Griffin, are you saying that you've been under surveillance? Yes. Last week, I confronted a private investigator who had been watching my house for 2 days. The police traced the license plate to a firm in Hartford, but the company wouldn't reveal who hired them. Madison's face went pale. Hazel, I don't know what you're talking about. I would never hire anyone to watch you. Dr. Kellerman, I filed a police report about the surveillance. Detective Rodriguez at the local police department can verify everything I've told you. The psychiatrist was now looking at Madison and Michael with a very different expression, one that suggested she was reevaluating the entire situation. Mrs. Walsh, were you aware of any surveillance of Mrs. Griffin's property? Of course not. I would never do anything like that. But her denial lacked conviction, and I could see doubt creeping into Dr. Kellerman's professional assessment. Dr. Kellerman, I said quietly, I think you should also know that Madison has been telling my son that I have memory problems and confusion, claims that are completely false and can be disproven by the medical evaluations I mentioned earlier. What kind of claims? That I couldn't remember conversations we'd had, that I repeated myself, that I seemed confused about basic facts. None of it is true, and I believe she's been deliberately fabricating symptoms of cognitive decline to support this intervention. Dr. Kellerman closed her notepad and looked directly at Madison. Mrs. Walsh, these are very serious allegations. If Mrs. Griffin is correct about the medical evaluations showing normal cognitive function, and if there's evidence that you've made false statements about her mental health, this could constitute elder abuse. Madison stood up abruptly, her composed facade finally cracking completely. This is ridiculous. I'm trying to help her, and she's turning it into some kind of conspiracy theory. Michael, tell her. Tell Dr. Kellerman how worried we've been. But Michael was staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. It might have been dawning realization or guilt or both. Mom, he said slowly, the things Madison told me about your memory problems, were they really not true? I looked at my son, this man I had raised and loved and sacrificed for, and saw him truly seeing me for the first time in months. They were not true, Michael. I have never shown any signs of memory loss or confusion. Madison has been systematically lying to you about my mental state in order to gain your support for this intervention. The silence in the room was deafening. Dr. Kellerman was making rapid notes, clearly recognizing that the dynamic she had expected to find was not the reality of the situation. Madison was standing frozen, probably calculating her next move, and Michael was looking back and forth between his wife and his mother, trying to reconcile what he was hearing with what he had been told. Dr. Kellerman finally broke the silence. Mrs. Griffin, based on my conversation with you today, I see no evidence of cognitive impairment or mental health issues that would warrant involuntary intervention. Your responses have been coherent, appropriate, and well-reasoned. Your memory appears to be excellent, and your decision-making process, while perhaps not aligned with your family's preferences, seems to be based on rational considerations. Madison stepped forward, desperation creeping into her voice. But what about the medical records she claims to have? How do we know they're real? Mrs. Griffin offered to provide copies of recent medical evaluations from her physicians. If those evaluations support her claims of normal cognitive function, they would carry significant weight in any legal proceeding. I stood up, gently moving Fitzgerald to his favorite cushion. Dr. Kellerman, I'll get those records for you right now. I went to my study and retrieved the folder containing my medical evaluations, along with the letter from Dr. Chen documenting my cognitive assessment. When I returned to the living room, I handed the entire folder to Dr. Kellerman. She spent several minutes reviewing the documents, her expression growing more grave with each page. Mrs. Walsh, these medical records clearly document normal cognitive function, excellent physical health, and no evidence of any condition that would impair Mrs. Griffin's judgment or decision-making capacity. The evaluations were conducted just 3 weeks ago by board-certified physicians at reputable medical institutions. Madison's last desperate gambit was to attack the credibility of the medical evaluations themselves. But she could have coached the doctors, told them what to say. Or maybe she's been hiding her symptoms when she's around medical professionals. Dr. Kellerman looked at Madison with the kind of expression usually reserved for particularly troublesome patients. Mrs. Walsh, the evaluations included objective cognitive testing that cannot be faked or manipulated. Blood work, brain imaging, and standardized neuropsychological assessments all support the conclusion that Mrs. Griffin is in excellent mental health. The reality of the situation was finally sinking in for Madison. Not only had her plan failed, but her behavior during the evaluation had actually worked against her. Dr. Kellerman was now looking at her as the potential abuser rather than the concerned family member. Furthermore, Dr. Kellerman continued, the allegations Mrs. Griffin has made about surveillance and false statements regarding her mental health are extremely concerning. If substantiated, they could constitute criminal elder abuse under Connecticut law. Madison grabbed her purse and headed for the door. This is insane. I was trying to help. And you're all acting like I'm some kind of criminal. Michael, we're leaving. But Michael didn't move. He was still sitting on my couch, staring at his hands, looking like a man whose entire worldview had just been shattered. Michael, Madison called from the doorway. We're leaving. Now. You go ahead, he said quietly. I need to talk to my mother. Madison's face contorted with rage. Fine. But don't expect me to forget this betrayal. Any of you. She slammed the door behind her, leaving an almost palpable sense of relief in her wake. Dr. Kellerman packed up her materials and handed me her business card. Mrs. Griffin, I'm going to file a report stating that I found no evidence of cognitive impairment or any need for intervention. I'm also going to recommend that the allegations of elder abuse be investigated further. Thank you, Dr. Kellerman. I appreciate your professionalism. After she left, Michael and I sat in silence for several minutes. Fitzgerald jumped back onto my lap, purring softly, as if he sensed that the danger had passed. Mom, Michael finally said, I owe you an apology. A huge apology. Yes, you do. I don't even know where to start. I believed everything Madison told me about your memory problems, your confusion. I thought I was helping you by supporting this intervention. Michael, your wife has been systematically lying to you about my mental health for months. She hired private investigators to spy on me. She brought a psychiatrist to my home to try to have me declared incompetent. Do you understand what that means? He nodded, his eyes filled with tears. It means she was trying to steal from you. She was trying to get control of your money and property by having you declared mentally incompetent. That's exactly what it means. And if Dr. Kellerman hadn't been ethical enough to recognize the truth, Madison might have succeeded. I feel so stupid, so blind. How did I not see what she was doing? I reached over and took his hand. Because you loved her, and you wanted to believe the best of her, and because she's very, very good at manipulation. What do I do now, Mom? How do I go home and face her after this? It was a question I couldn't answer for him. Michael would have to decide for himself whether his marriage could survive the revelation of Madison's true character, whether he could trust someone who had been willing to abuse his mother for financial gain. That's something you'll have to figure out for yourself, sweetheart. But I want you to know that whatever you decide, I'll support you. We talked for another hour, with Michael asking questions about everything that had happened over the past few months. I told him about the surveillance, about Madison's lies, about the escalating campaign to undermine my autonomy. With each revelation, he looked more stricken, more ashamed of his role in enabling her behavior. When he finally left, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. Vindication, certainly, and relief that the immediate threat was over, but also sadness for my son, who was facing the collapse of his marriage and the terrible knowledge that he had been used as a weapon against his own mother. The next few days passed quietly. The closing on my house proceeded as scheduled, with no last-minute interference from Madison or anyone else. I signed the papers, handed over the keys, and walked away with a check for $420,000, significantly more than I had expected. Patricia, my real estate agent, was effusive in her congratulations. "Hazel, this is one of the smoothest transactions I've handled all year. You should be very proud of yourself for managing such a major life transition so successfully." If she only knew, I thought to myself. I used part of the proceeds to buy my townhouse in Portsmouth outright, leaving me with no mortgage payments and substantial assets still available for my new life. The rest went into the scholarship fund, bringing the total endowment to over $600,000. Amanda Torres from the community college called to thank me again for the expanded funding. "Mrs. Griffin, we've already identified 12 students who will receive full scholarships for the spring semester. These are young people who would never have been able to afford college otherwise. You're literally changing the trajectory of their entire lives." Hearing about the scholarship recipients filled me with a satisfaction that went far deeper than any material possession ever could. Madison had seen my assets as something to be seized and hoarded. I had turned them into opportunity and hope for people who needed both. 3 weeks after the psychiatric evaluation, Detective Rodriguez called with an update on the surveillance investigation. "Mrs. Griffin, we've made some progress on your case. The private investigation firm finally provided us with information about who hired them, and you're not going to be surprised to learn that it was Mrs. Madison Walsh." "Can you prove it?" "We have credit card records showing payments from her account to the investigation firm, as well as email communications outlining the scope of the surveillance. It's enough to charge her with stalking under Connecticut law." "What happens now?" "That depends on whether you want to press charges. Given everything else that's happened, the district attorney's office is also considering elder abuse charges based on Dr. Kellerman's report." I thought about it for several days. Pursuing criminal charges against Madison would create more drama and probably make things more difficult for Michael. On the other hand, letting her behavior go unpunished might encourage her to try similar tactics with other vulnerable people. In the end, I decided to press charges. Not out of vindictiveness, but because Madison's actions represented a serious crime that needed to have consequences. The legal process moved forward slowly but steadily. Madison hired an expensive attorney and tried to claim that her actions were motivated by genuine concern for my welfare, but the evidence was overwhelming. The surveillance, the lies about my mental health, the attempted psychiatric intervention without cause, all of it painted a picture of calculated elder abuse. Michael filed for divorce 6 weeks after the psychiatric evaluation. He told me later that living with Madison after learning the truth about her behavior had become impossible. "I keep thinking about all the times she convinced me that you were being difficult or unreasonable," he said during one of our regular phone calls. "How many of those situations were just her manipulating me into taking her side against you?" "The important thing is that you see the truth now," I told him. "We can't change the past, but we can build a better future." Madison eventually pleaded guilty to stalking charges in exchange for probation and a restraining order that prohibited her from contacting me or coming within 500 feet of my property. The elder abuse charges were dropped as part of the plea agreement, something I agreed to in order to avoid a lengthy trial. I moved to New Hampshire in December, just as the first snow was beginning to fall. My new townhouse was everything I had hoped it would be: cozy, manageable, and perfectly suited to my new life. I decorated it with my grandmother's china, my mother's quilts, and the books I had collected over a lifetime of reading. Every corner reflected my own taste and personality, free from anyone else's judgment or criticism. The Portsmouth community welcomed me with open arms. My neighbors were a diverse group of people who had chosen the area for its combination of history, culture, and natural beauty. Unlike Madison, they were interested in who I was as a person, not what I owned or what I might leave them in my will. I threw myself into my new activities with enthusiasm. The garden club gave me access to expertise and friendship that enriched both my gardening skills and my social life. The pottery classes revealed an artistic talent I had never known I possessed. Volunteering at the library connected me with people of all ages who shared my love of books and learning. Most satisfying of all was my involvement with the scholarship program. Amanda Torres arranged for me to meet several of the scholarship recipients, and their stories were both heartbreaking and inspiring. There was Maria, a single mother of two who was pursuing a degree in elementary education after working as a hotel housekeeper for 15 years. There was David, a young man from a rural town who had never imagined he could afford college, but dreamed of becoming a librarian. There was Sarah, a military veteran who wanted to teach high school history after her service ended. Each of them represented the kind of person I had once been, someone with dreams and potential who just needed an opportunity to succeed. Knowing that my money was making their education possible filled me with a purpose and satisfaction that no material possession had ever provided. Michael visited me in Portsmouth in February, bringing his new girlfriend, a kind woman named Jennifer who worked as a nurse and seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me as a person rather than as a potential source of inheritance. It was the first time I had seen him truly relaxed and happy in months. "Mom," he said as we walked along the harbor on a crisp winter afternoon, "I want you to know how proud I am of you, not just for standing up to Madison, but for building this new life for yourself. You're inspiring." "Thank you, sweetheart. But I have to say, the best part of all this has been rebuilding our relationship without Madison's interference. I know I have a lot to make up for. I let her convince me that your independence was somehow a threat to our family, when it was actually the best thing that could have happened to you." We stopped at a bench overlooking the water, watching seagulls dive for fish in the choppy waves. "Michael, I want you to understand something. Everything I went through with Madison, as painful as it was, led me to this life. If she hadn't pushed me to the breaking point, I might never have found the courage to start over. In a strange way, I'm almost grateful to her." "That's very generous of you, Mom." "It's not generosity, it's honesty. Madison thought she was taking my life away from me, but she actually gave me a better one. She wanted me to smell like old people in Bankruptcy, but instead, she forced me to discover that I smell like freedom and possibility." 6 months later, I received an invitation that brought the story full circle. The community college was hosting a scholarship dinner to honor the donors and celebrate the recipients' achievements. I was asked to speak about the Hazel and Richard Griffin Scholarship Fund and its impact on the students' lives. I stood at the podium in the college's small auditorium, looking out at an audience filled with scholarship recipients, their families, college administrators, and other donors. In the back row, I spotted Michael and Jennifer, who had driven up from Connecticut to support me. 2 years ago, I began, I was a different person living a different life. I was someone who defined myself entirely through my relationships with other people, someone who believed that my worth came from how much I could give and how little I asked for in return. I told them about Richard's death, about the years of loneliness and uncertainty that followed. I talked about the importance of education in my own life, and my desire to help others achieve their dreams. I didn't mention Madison by name, but I spoke about the experience of having my autonomy challenged and how that challenge had ultimately led to my transformation. The students who receive these scholarships are building better lives for themselves and their families. But I want you to know that they've also given me something invaluable: the knowledge that my money, my time, and my life can make a real difference in the world. When I finished speaking, the applause was warm and sustained. Several of the scholarship recipients came up afterward to thank me personally, sharing their stories and their plans for the future. Their gratitude was genuine and deeply moving, but what struck me most was how they saw me, not as a benefactor to be managed or manipulated, but as a partner in their success. After the dinner, Michael and Jennifer walked me back to my car. "Mom, that was beautiful," Jennifer said. "You should be so proud of what you've accomplished." "I am proud," I said, and realized that it was true. For the first time in my life, I'm truly proud of who I am and what I've built. Driving home through the quiet streets of Portsmouth, I thought about how completely my life had changed. 2 years ago, I had been living in fear of Madison's judgment, trying to shrink myself to fit into the narrow space she had allocated for me. Now I was living in a beautiful home I had chosen for myself, surrounded by friends who valued me for who I was, supporting students whose success would outlast all of us. Madison had wanted to make me smell like an old person, like someone whose best days were behind her. Instead, her cruelty had forced me to discover that my best days were just beginning. She had tried to push me toward bankruptcy, emotional, and financial. But I had turned her attack into abundance, creating wealth in the form of relationships, purpose, and joy that no one could ever take away from me. When I got home, Fitzgerald was waiting by the door, purring his welcome. I picked him up and carried him to the living room, where we settled into my favorite chair to watch the late news. The house was quiet and peaceful, filled with the contentment that comes from knowing you are exactly where you belong. Tomorrow, I would tend my garden. I would work on a new pottery project. I would have lunch with Eleanor and discuss our plans for the garden club's spring fundraiser. I would call Maria to see how her student teaching was going, and check in with David about his first semester at library school. These were small things, ordinary things, but they were mine. No one could criticize them, diminish them, or take them away from me. They were the building blocks of a life lived on my own terms, for my own purposes, according to my own values. Madison had thought she was clever, patient, strategic in her campaign to control my life and assets. But she had made one crucial mistake. She had underestimated the strength and determination of a woman who had finally learned her own worth. In trying to make me smell like old people and bankruptcy, she had forced me to discover that I actually smelled like victory. 6 months after the scholarship dinner, I was kneeling in my garden, carefully transplanting the last of my mother's heirloom roses, when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but something about the timing made me answer despite my soil-covered hands. "Mrs. Griffin? This is Detective Rodriguez. I'm calling with some news about Madison Walsh that I thought you should know about." I sat back on my heels, brushing dirt from my palm. "What kind of news?" "She's been arrested again. This time it's for elder abuse, but not involving you. A different family, a different victim. The pattern is almost identical to what she tried with you." My blood ran cold. I had wondered, in the quiet moments when my mind wandered to darker thoughts, whether Madison would learn from her failed attempt with me, or simply find an easier target. Now I had my answer. Who is the victim? An 80-year-old man named Robert Chen. His daughter married Madison's brother 6 months ago. The family dynamics are remarkably similar to your situation, Mrs. Griffin. The daughter-in-law gaining the son's trust, gradually isolating the elderly parent, then escalating to false claims about mental incompetence. I closed my eyes, feeling a wave of guilt wash over me. Had my decision to accept the plea agreement somehow enabled Madison to victimize someone else? Should I have insisted on a trial that might have put her in prison instead of just giving her probation? "Detective, is there anything I can do to help with this case?" "Actually, yes. The prosecutor wants to know if you'd be willing to testify about your experiences with Madison. Your case establishes a pattern of behavior that could be crucial in securing a conviction." "Of course. Whatever you need." 2 weeks later, I found myself in a Hartford courthouse, sitting in a witness room and preparing to testify about the most difficult period of my recent life. It felt strange to be back in Connecticut. Even stranger to be voluntarily placing myself in Madison's orbit again. But when I thought about Robert Chen, about what he must be going through with his own family, I knew I had made the right choice. The prosecutor, a sharp young woman named Assistant District Attorney Sarah Kim, had prepared me thoroughly for my testimony. She explained how my experience with Madison would help establish the defendant's modus operandi, showing that the abuse of Robert Chen wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a calculated pattern. "Mrs. Griffin, when you take the stand, I want you to be completely honest about what Madison put you through. Don't minimize it, don't try to be charitable. The jury needs to understand the systematic nature of psychological elder abuse." When my name was called, I walked into the courtroom with my head held high. The space was smaller than I had expected, with perhaps 50 people scattered across the wooden benches. I could see Robert Chen sitting in the front row with a man who must have been his son, both looking fragile and exhausted in the way that comes from months of family trauma. And there, at the defendant's table, was Madison. She looked different than she had during our confrontation. Thinner, with a hardness around her eyes that made her beauty seem brittle and artificial. She was wearing a conservative navy suit that I suspected her lawyer had chosen to make her appear more sympathetic, but it couldn't disguise the coldness in her expression when she looked at me. As I took the oath and settled into the witness chair, I felt a calmness that surprised me. This wasn't about revenge or personal vindication anymore. This was about justice for Robert Chen and prevention of future victims. Ada Kim began with basic questions about my background and relationship to Madison, establishing the timeline of events. Then she moved into the heart of my testimony. Mrs. Griffin, can you describe how Madison's behavior toward you changed over time? It was very gradual at first. Small criticisms disguised as helpful suggestions. Comments about my appearance, my home, my lifestyle that were presented as concern but were actually meant to undermine my confidence. Can you give the jury specific examples? I described Madison's comments about my clothes being vintage, her suggestions that my cooking was unhealthy, her constant recommendations for how I could improve myself to be more acceptable to her friends. With each example, I could see the jury members nodding slightly, recognizing patterns they might have seen in their own lives. Did this behavior escalate over time? Yes. As I began to assert more independence, Madison's tactics became more aggressive. She began telling my son that I was showing signs of memory loss and confusion, claims that were completely false. How did these false claims affect your relationship with your son? Michael began to doubt my judgment and decision-making capacity. He started treating me like someone who couldn't be trusted to manage her own affairs. It was devastating to realize that my own son believed I was mentally incompetent because of his wife's lies. Ada Kim walked me through the surveillance, the psychiatric evaluation attempt, and Madison's systematic efforts to gain control of my assets. With each detail, Madison's lawyer objected, but the judge allowed most of my testimony to stand. The most difficult part came when Ada Kim asked about the emotional impact of Madison's abuse. Mrs. Griffin, how did this experience affect you personally? I took a breath, looking directly at the jury. For months, I questioned my own sanity. When someone you trust tells you repeatedly that you're confused, forgetful, or making poor decisions, you start to believe it. I began second-guessing every choice I made, wondering if I really was becoming the incompetent old woman Madison claimed I was. And how do you feel about that experience now? I feel grateful that I found the strength to resist Madison's manipulation, but I also feel responsible for what's happening to Mr. Chen. If I had pushed for a stronger prosecution of Madison's crimes against me, she might not have been free to victimize another family. Madison's lawyer objected to that statement, and the judge instructed the jury to disregard it, but I could see that my words had made an impact. The cross-examination was predictably brutal. Madison's attorney, a slick man in an expensive suit, tried to paint me as a vindictive ex-mother-in-law who had fabricated claims of abuse after her son's marriage fell apart. Mrs. Griffin, isn't it true that you were jealous of your son's relationship with his wife? No, that's not true. I was initially very welcoming to Madison and tried hard to include her in our family. But you've admitted that you didn't approve of some of her suggestions for improving your lifestyle. I didn't object to suggestions. I objected to being manipulated and controlled. Mrs. Griffin, you've described what you call a pattern of psychological abuse, but isn't it possible that Madison was simply trying to help an elderly woman who was struggling with the normal challenges of aging? This was the crux of Madison's defense, that her behavior had been motivated by genuine concern rather than greed and manipulation. Sir, if Madison had been genuinely concerned about my welfare, she would have encouraged me to see my doctor or seek professional help. Instead, she hired private investigators to spy on me and tried to have me declared mentally incompetent without any medical evidence. Those are not the actions of someone who wants to help. The lawyer tried several more approaches, but I had lived through Madison's manipulation, and I knew how to recognize and counter her tactics. By the time the cross-examination ended, I felt confident that the jury had heard the truth about what Madison was capable of doing to vulnerable people. After my testimony, I was allowed to stay and observe the rest of the trial. Robert Chen took the stand the next day, and his story was heartbreakingly similar to mine. Madison's brother had married Robert's daughter, and within months, Madison was suggesting that the elderly man was becoming a burden on the young couple. The pattern was identical: gradual isolation from friends and family, false claims about mental decline, attempts to gain control of financial assets, and escalating psychological pressure designed to make Robert question his own competence. But there were differences too. Robert was older and more physically frail than I had been, which made him more vulnerable to Madison's manipulation. His daughter was completely under Madison's influence, unlike Michael, who had eventually seen through his wife's lies. And Madison had been more brazen in her financial schemes, actually attempting to transfer money from Robert's accounts before the family's lawyer had intervened. When the jury returned their verdict after only 4 hours of deliberation, I felt a profound sense of relief. Guilty on all counts: elder abuse, fraud, conspiracy, and attempted theft. The judge sentenced Madison to 3 years in prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. As the bailiff led Madison away in handcuffs, she turned and looked directly at me. There was no remorse in her expression, no acknowledgement of the harm she had caused, just cold anger and what looked like a promise that this wasn't over. Robert Chen approached me outside the courthouse, leaning heavily on his son's arm but with clear eyes and a firm handshake. "Mrs. Griffin, I can't thank you enough for testifying. Your courage in speaking up gave me the strength to fight back against what Madison was trying to do to me. Mr. Chen, I'm just glad that you had family who were willing to listen and get help. I'm sorry you had to go through this at all." His son, David, spoke up. "Mrs. Griffin, the prosecutor told us about the scholarship fund you established. Dad and I would like to make a contribution, if that would be appropriate. We want something good to come out of this terrible experience." 3 months later, I received a check from the Chen family for $50,000, designated for the Hazel and Richard Griffin Scholarship Fund. The accompanying letter explained that Robert Chen had been a high school teacher for 40 years before his retirement, and that supporting educational opportunities felt like the perfect way to honor his career and transform their negative experience into something positive. The additional funding allowed us to expand the scholarship program significantly. Instead of 4 full scholarships per year, we could now offer 8, plus several smaller grants for students who needed help with books, supplies, or other educational expenses. I was reviewing applications for the expanded program when I received an unexpected phone call from Michael. "Mom, I have some news that I thought you should hear from me rather than from someone else." "What kind of news?" "Jennifer and I are engaged. We're planning a small wedding this fall, and I was hoping you would be willing to help us plan it." The irony wasn't lost on me. 2 years earlier, I had been desperately trying to please Madison and earn her approval for my role in her wedding planning. Now my son was asking for my help in creating a celebration that would actually be about love and family rather than status and control. "Michael, I would be honored to help you plan your wedding, but more importantly, I'm happy that you found someone who loves and respects you the way you deserve." Jennifer came on the line, her voice warm and genuine. "Mrs. Griffin, I want you to know that I would never try to come between you and Michael. I think what Madison did to you was horrible, and I want our family to be built on honesty and mutual respect. The wedding planning process was everything that Madison's had not been." Jennifer was interested in my opinions and suggestions, but she also had her own clear vision for what she wanted. She didn't try to change me or manage me. She simply included me as a valued member of the family team. We decided to have the ceremony in Portsmouth, in the garden of a historic inn overlooking the harbor. It would be small and intimate, with just immediate family and close friends. Jennifer asked me to do one of the readings, and I chose a passage from Khalil Gibran about love that had always meant something special to me. As the wedding day approached, I found myself thinking about the different ways that families can be created and destroyed. Madison had tried to use marriage as a weapon to gain control and accumulate assets. Jennifer was using it as a foundation for building something genuine and lasting. The ceremony was beautiful in its simplicity. Michael and Jennifer exchanged vows they had written themselves, speaking about partnership, respect, and supporting each other's individual growth. When Jennifer promised to love and honor not just Michael but his family as well, I had to wipe away tears. At the reception, I gave a toast that I had been thinking about for weeks. "Marriage," I said, raising my glass to the small gathering of friends and family, "is not about finding someone who completes you. It's about finding someone who inspires you to complete yourself. Jennifer, thank you for seeing the best in my son and encouraging him to be the man I always knew he could be. And thank you for welcoming me into your family with open arms and an open heart. Later that evening, as I was helping clean up after the reception, Jennifer pulled me aside. Mrs. Griffin, I want you to know that Michael told me everything about what happened with Madison. I can't imagine how difficult that must have been for you, but I'm amazed by how you turned such a negative experience into something so positive. Jennifer, I've learned that we can't control what other people do to us, but we can control how we respond. Madison tried to diminish me, but she actually forced me to discover my own strength. I hope I can be half as strong as you are if I ever face that kind of challenge. You already are, Jennifer. The way you've handled joining our family, the respect you've shown for our history and our relationships, tells me everything I need to know about your character. As I drove home to my townhouse that night, I reflected on how completely my life had been transformed. 2 years earlier, I had been fighting for my basic autonomy and dignity, struggling to maintain my sense of self in the face of Madison's systematic abuse. Now I was surrounded by people who valued me for who I was, not what I could provide for them. The scholarship fund continued to grow and evolve. We had established partnerships with 3 different community colleges, expanding our reach to help students across New England. I had also started mentoring some of the scholarship recipients, meeting with them monthly to provide guidance and support as they navigated their educational journeys. One of my mentees was a young woman named Lisa, who reminded me of myself at that age, hardworking, determined, but lacking confidence in her own abilities. She was studying to become an elementary school teacher, working 2 part-time jobs while raising a young daughter as a single mother. Mrs. Griffin, she told me during one of our coffee meetings, the scholarship isn't just paying for my education. It's giving me hope that I can actually build a better life for my daughter and myself. Lisa, the scholarship is just the beginning. Your hard work and determination are what will make the real difference. But without this opportunity, I never would have been able to try. You've changed the entire trajectory of our lives. Conversations like that reminded me why I had been willing to endure Madison's attacks and fight for my independence. The money that she had coveted so desperately was now creating opportunities for people who had been written off by society. People who just needed someone to believe in their potential. On the 2nd anniversary of my move to Portsmouth, I threw a garden party for all the friends I had made in my new community. My backyard was filled with laughter and conversation as members of the garden club, my pottery classmates, library volunteers, and scholarship recipients mingled together. Eleanor, my neighbor who had become one of my closest friends, raised her glass during the informal toasting portion of the evening. 2 years ago, Hazel arrived in Portsmouth as a refugee from family drama. Today, she's one of the most beloved members of our community. She's taught us that it's never too late to start over, and that sometimes the worst things that happen to us can become the catalyst for the best things. As I looked around at the faces of people who had become my chosen family, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought me to this moment. Madison had tried to make me smell like old people in bankruptcy, like someone whose value had expired and whose assets were available for the taking. Instead, her cruelty had forced me to discover that I smelled like possibility, like someone who still had important work to do in the world. She had wanted to reduce me to my lowest common denominator, but I had chosen to rise to my highest potential. The evening ended with Maria, one of my first scholarship recipients, sharing the news that she had just been hired as a 3rd-grade teacher in her hometown. Her tears of joy as she described her first classroom were the perfect reminder of why I had fought so hard to protect my independence and my assets. Mrs. Griffin, she said, I want my students to know that there are people in the world who believe in them, who are willing to invest in their futures even when they come from difficult circumstances. You've shown me what that kind of generosity looks like. As I cleaned up after the party, I thought about the letter I planned to write to the scholarship committee the next day. I wanted to increase the endowment again, to ensure that the fund would continue growing and helping students long after I was gone. Madison had thought she was playing a long game, patiently working to position herself to inherit my assets when I died. She had never considered that I might live long enough to give those assets away myself, to see them transformed into something far more valuable than money in a bank account. I was 75 years old now, in excellent health and more engaged with life than I had been in decades. The woman Madison had tried to diminish and control had become someone she never could have imagined. A philanthropist, a mentor, a community leader, and most importantly, a person who knew her own worth and refused to let anyone else define her value. The next morning, I woke up in my beautiful townhouse, made coffee in my perfectly appointed kitchen, and sat in my garden to plan another day of meaningful work. Fitzgerald jumped onto my lap, purring contentedly, and I scratched behind his ears while I reviewed the scholarship applications that had arrived in yesterday's mail. Each application represented a dream, a person who was betting on themselves despite difficult circumstances. Reading their stories of perseverance and hope, I was reminded once again that Madison's attempt to destroy me had actually created something far more powerful than she could have imagined. She had wanted to make me smell like failure and irrelevance. Instead, she had forced me to discover that I smelled like triumph and possibility, like someone who had turned pain into purpose and cruelty into compassion. And that, I reflected as I began reviewing the applications for the next round of scholarships, was the sweetest revenge of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.